Good evening, everybody. Delighted to see so many of you here, and thank you for coming. So, just to introduce you to Stephanie, and the reason why she's here, first of all, is because she will be chairing the jury of the RIAI Universal Design Award tomorrow, the final stage of that jury. And this award has been supported by the Centre of Excellence in Universal Design for the last 2 years, and we say thank you to Ger Craddock and to Ruth and those from the Centre, Neil, of course, who's very much involved, from the Centre of Excellence. This building that we're in now, UCD Student Centre, which of course was designed by Fitzgerald Kavanagh, won the award last year. And what was interesting about that is that it also won the Public Choice Award. And we think that's quite apt that the Universal Design Award also should be given to a building that quite independently won the award selected by the public. And I know I don't see Tina Lowe here tonight, but Tina is the access officer in UCD who herself is a guide dog user. And she really swung me with her citation for this building and how much it meant to her. For the first time, she was able to do things that she'd never been able to do before. She was able to use the swimming pool. She was able to enjoy the facilities in the building with great ease, and I think that's a credit to the architects. She just said, I wish every building on the campus could be as good as this. So that's what we like to hear, and that's what the award is about, is supporting and encouraging architects to work more with people and engaging in designing buildings for people that can then interact with their environment. So Stephanie Akkaoui Hughes is from the Lebanon. She's an architect educated in Beirut. And I had the pleasure to visit the Lebanon last December. And of course, I slipped away from a couple of meetings. And where did I go? To the American University, which was where she studied. And I was delighted to go into the School of Architecture there. And what did I see? The first thing that I saw as I walked in the door of the School of Architecture, an exhibition on contemporary architecture, and their first image was a photograph of the Bianconi Institute designed by Irish architects, Grafton architects. And next to that was a building from Qatar. Now, I don't think it was a building that you designed, Stephanie, but when Stephanie left Beirut, she went to the Netherlands, where she worked with OMA, with Rem Koolhaas, I'm sure. And while there, she worked on several buildings. She was a team lead for 3 buildings in Qatar, including the Qatar Foundation headquarters, the National Library, isn't that right? And also a Strategic Studies Centre. So on leaving OMA, she set up her own practice, AKKA Architects, and we're going to hear more about the philosophy of that practice and of her work this evening, which is about human interaction and interacting with one's environment. Stephanie, I'm going to let you, before I just let you take over, if I can say that at the end of her talk, we're going to have a short question and answer session, and then CUD have very kindly invited you all to join them in refreshments outside.
Thank you. All our actions are interactions. An architect was asked to design a university campus on a site that, seen from above, would have looked something like this. So she designs the different departments and builds them on site. And contrary to the expectation of the staff and students, she doesn't design any routes or pathways. Instead, she plants the whole site with grass. Obviously, this is well-grown grass. After the first semester, paths have appeared in the grass. She then came back and paved them just as they had emerged. Not only were the paths in unusual locations, none of them were straight. There are 3 aspects, 3 concepts I want to highlight from the story here today. The first one has to do with interaction. Now, I'd like you to shout out to me on my count of 3. What is the first word that comes to your mind when I say interaction? Ready? 1, 2, 3. Connections. Work. People. One more. Spaces. Thank you. Interaction could mean a lot of things. If we take it literally, it's really inter and action, which is the action happening in between entities. A relationship, you see, is a status between two entities. It's a static status. An interaction is that relationship put into action, made alive, energized. An interaction for me is a living relationship. Any interaction you can think of, any at all, always happens within a context. And context is the second notion I'd like to highlight from the story. Now, by context, I mean the environment, the space we're in. And that includes, the paper you have in your hand, the chair you're sitting on, this room, the building, the city, and the people. Context is crucial because context is what gives meaning to the interactions happening in it. Neil, would you please stand up for a second? Would you please put your right hand up like that? Great. Ladies and gentlemen, what is Neil doing? Any ideas? What if I said he was on a street corner in New York City? What if he was 12 years old in a classroom? What if I said he was at a neo-Nazi rally? Thank you. Without context, we cannot understand the meaning of an interaction. Context is what gives meaning to our interactions. And that's why it's crucial, whatever interaction was looking at, to look at it in its context. The third concept I want to highlight from the story has to do with living spaces. Now, we've looked at interactions as living relationships, and now they happen in a context. It's precisely those interactions that render the context a living space. And spaces are made to be lived in. An empty space is a dead space, which is why, for me, architecture is only successful when it's actually livable, when it's lived in, when it's alive. And when we talk about spaces being lived in, we're talking about spaces being lived in by people. Not customers or clients or bosses or employees or abled or disabled, but really just people. And people come in different sizes and different shapes with different needs at different times. The success of a space, for me at least, is really in its ability to actually adapt. How well does the space adapt to these different sizes and different shapes? How well does it adapt to different needs? And how well does it adapt at different times? And this is why I believe that our focus, especially as architects, planners, anybody involved in the built environment, is to focus on creating an environment that can be used by all people regardless of age, size, and ability. Now, this is what universal design is, and it's also, of course, the center's definition of it. Mr. Mace, who is the architect who coined the term of universal design, actually defined it in quite an interesting way. He talked about universal design as designing an environment to be aesthetic and usable to the greatest extent possible by everyone, regardless of their age, ability, or status in life. Whichever way we look at it, universal design has something always there. It's this notion of being usable by all people, no matter how we define it. Even bringing in the idea of status in life is quite important. Now, although the term universal design has been coined at a certain moment in time, the concept of it, of course, is not new. The concept of it is old, and it should be implicit in any good design. This is like, the term sustainability, which has become a trend over the last few years, and actually not anymore. There's something new that's going to come up now. Sustainability and universal design should be implicit in any good design, to the point where ideally we shouldn't have to make an issue of them or have to talk about them. Now, who here is an architect? Whoa. Planners? One. Policymakers? Who here is a user? My point is, this topic is relevant to all of us, because no matter what our profession is, we're all using spaces. And we all have a responsibility towards universal design, whether architects, planners, policymakers, engineers, and users, which basically means everybody. What I'd like to talk about today is my own personal ideas and conceptions around universal design. And I'm sure a lot of the concepts I'm going to mention here are not new to you. You may be familiar with a lot of them. What I'm hoping to do is share my personal perspective on them and hopefully enrich a dialogue, trigger a conversation around the bigger, more comprehensive sense of universal design. Now, if I put it really simply, universal design to me is about the use of spaces. And how people use a space comes down to the interactions that happens in the space. That's what it comes down to, the interactions of people in spaces. The idea of universal design is really comprehensive. I was talking to Niels before, and actually anything can be put under universal design because it's about people and it's about all people. And they're everywhere in spaces and environments. Now, over the years and a few contexts, the understanding of universal design has been limited to wheelchairs and accessibility and barrier-free design notions. And those are all limiting rules. They're not liberating concepts. If you think about all of these, it's about rules and regulations, and they're very often added as a second thought after the project is done, as opposed to being an integral, fruitful part of the design process, the one that creates the building in the first place. Universal and unity have the same root. And that root means one. Now, what I'd like to highlight here is that unity does not mean sameness or homogeneity or one size fits all. Unity is really unity in diversity. If you look at nature, it's one of the most complex and complete examples of a unified system, a unified ecology. And yet it is incredibly diverse. Let me take a moment to expand on diversity. In one word, what do you think of when we think of universal design? What comes to your mind? People. Nothing. Aren't you having a PhD in it? Any other ideas? Respect. That's great. What pops into your mind when we talk about universal design?
Elegance.
Elegance, nice. I haven't heard that one in a long time. I want to mention just a few of the principles of universal design here. And this is just a few: inclusive, aesthetic, adaptive, equitable, flexible, intuitive, simple, tolerant, easy, perceptible, comprehensible. We could go on and on with this list, but the pattern that emerges here, the one thing I want to highlight is that these are all liberating concepts. Designing a space that's adaptive, that, ladies and gentlemen, is liberating. Designing a space that's tolerant, that's fantastically liberating. And this is what I want to stress here today, this comprehensive and large understanding of universal design and how it actually can be the starting point of any design process as opposed to a second layer added on it. And this building we're here today is a great example of that. I want to mention a quote by Michael Wolff, who said, "When you include the extremes of everybody, that is to say differently abled people of all sorts, then you produce things that are better for all of us." And that's incredibly true. And if we think of that, it means a fundamental shift from the beginning of the process. We're not using universal design for some people that have some special needs. It should be there from the beginning because it produces something better for all of us. And again, this building did not win the awards for nothing. It's a great testimonial to that. I'd like to take a moment and then recap quickly my thinking that I shared so far. We've looked at interactions as living relationships and how they happen in a context, and the importance of that context to be a universal context. Now, what universal design is pointing at is those interactions. Those are what make the context a universal context, and this is where our responsibility starts, in fostering these interactions. Here are the three most important things I'm going to share with you today. The first thing about interaction is you don't design interactions. You design the context for interactions. Second most important thing I will share with you today here is you don't design interactions. You design the context for interactions. And what is the third most important thing I will share with you today? You don't design interaction. You design the context for interaction. And that's specifically because the very nature of interaction is spontaneous and context dependent. We can't design it and dictate it and create it because that goes against its reason of being in a way. What we need to do is foster the interactions, and we do that by creating the context for interactions to emerge. Another way of saying that is you can't really design how people will use a building. Our responsibility is to design the building's ability to be used by people. It sounds like I'm saying the same thing in two different ways, but it's actually a fundamental difference. We can't design the way people will use it. We design the space's ability to be used. And that's essentially different from the beginning. The question is how? How do we do that? How do we create contexts that foster interactions? Now, this question is what drives my thinking, personally my work. And this is what led me to my philosophy of architecting interaction. A few years ago, I founded AKKA, like you were mentioning. And the reason AKKA was founded in the first place was to develop and implement architecting interaction. I couldn't find another environment to do so, so I had to just create it and proceed with that. The vision is, of course, developing, and it will be hopefully a lifetime work. And the implementation, the how, the real reality, making this vision real, is what we actually focus on at AKKA. Now, what I mean by architecting interaction, architecting is a term I use to embody the notion of a verb, an action, an ongoing process, which is what I believe architecture is. Interaction, as I mentioned, is simply the action happening in between entities. So if you look at architecting interaction, it's really exploring interactions between people, exploring the question of how do we create contexts that foster interactions. And we explore that question on a scale of intervention, a scale ranging from products to furniture to interiors to building to urban facilities. Remember, we don't design interaction, we design the context for interaction. Through our work at AKKA, we have learned something that's actually quite useful to us in our work. We have learned that any successful environment, any successful space you look at, is actually driven by three main forms of interactions. And those forms of interactions are collaboration, creativity, and learning. It is at the intersection of these forms of interaction that innovation emerges. It's by people coming together and interacting mainly with these three forms of interaction that value emerges. This is where things are created. This is where added value happens. And this is exactly why we have specialized at AKKA in actually designing spaces for collaboration, creativity, and learning. Now we could ask, which spaces actually need creativity, collaboration, and learning? Sir, could you think of a space that needs collaboration, creativity, or learning? A school? A street? An office? One more. Sorry. Family. That's excellent. My point is, every space needs to foster creativity, collaboration, and learning, starting from private homes all the way to the public realm. And that's because every space needs to foster interactions. They're only different interactions and only to varying degrees. Creating this context for interaction, this is the essence of architecting interaction. Context for interactions is what architecture is. This is what our built environment is about. This is even what our nature, so-called non-built environment is about. It's about context for interactions. What I want to mention here and stress, despite our big majority of architects in the room, is that architecture is made for the people using it. They're the ones who own it, not the architects who designed it. And I personally need to remember that every day, starting with myself, because we love our work and we get attached to it. But really, this is what architecture is. Because architecture is not a product that we just put out there. It's actually a service. And if you think of architecture as a service, then the starting point becomes the people using it. I'd like to talk a little bit about another shift of thinking and a shift of approach, and that is between form and flow. Now, not only has universal design been limited in its understanding and consequences in a way, it has been the predominant, concern of only a handful of architects. Today, contemporary architecture has largely become sculptural. At least this is what's portrayed. This is what's celebrated in magazines and brochures and so on. Most architects look at spaces from above, like a product, like a toy, like a bird might look at it with a distance. What they're focusing on is the form. And I think that's missing on a big chunk of work. That's missing on actually the flow that happens in those spaces. So what I strive to do consciously is actually shift my focus from the form to the flow. See, I believe that it's when starting with the flow that the form emerges. Now, I'd like to give a first example about that. I'm sure you have all come across these beautiful architectural photographs, website, posters, magazines, etc. These photographs are showing a beautifully designed space. Ladies and gentlemen, what's missing in those photographs? Thank you. Other audiences have had a hard time with this one, ironically enough. People. Not only is there not a single person in these images, there's not even a sign of a person having been there ever. And that, for me, is pretty disconcerting. The focus in these images is on the space as a form, as a sculpture, as a product. Another example to look at actually has to do with the public realm. And what I love about this is we really can see that it's not about what we built. It's about the void. And it's actually the void that creates the value. It's the void that people use. This is where people move, interact with the space, interact with each other. It's not about what something is. It's about what it does. And those shifts are all very important in reminding us where the focus is, where the driving force is. A third example. This one comes from our own work. These are images of a space we finished designing last year, actually, in Amsterdam. And what I like about these photographs is that they show the reality of a lived-in space, a space designed to be lived in. And just as I speak of living relationships, I want to speak about a living space. Now, the way we approach designing a space, I'm saying if we actually shift from the form to the flow, what does that mean? That means we look at the space through the flow of people, through the use of people. Densities, for example. Where do people gather? Where are the sedentary spaces? Where are the more fluctuant spaces? Where do people move around? Another aspect I want to look at here is those interaction nodes. Where do people tend to interact the most? Or the least? Or not at all? Interactions, remember, is to varying degrees, which means it's like a dimmer switch. You have less of it, you have more of it, you have different forms of it. Where are these interaction nodes happening, and how does the space fall into place around them? Another very important aspect is the density of activity in the space. And we like to think about this as the heartbeat of the space. This is what's happening in the space. This is really what's making it alive. Another very important aspect is actually the literal flow of people in the spaces. See, different people will use the space in different ways. Even the same person will use the space in different ways at different times. And it's important to actually look at these flows and study them before we understand what the form needs to be that emerges around them. Shifting from the form to the flow really means that it's from the flow that the form emerges. And that's a process we just need to trust. Let's take a step away from architecture for a second. I want to look at Einstein's formula, E = mc squared. Now, you might be familiar with this formula already. E is the energy, m the mass, and c the speed of light. Now, what we did is we took that formula and translated it into architectures, because that's what architects do. We just relate it to ourselves all the time again. So that's what we did with this formula as well. And what we found out is that we can simply associate the mass to the built mass, the bricks and mortar, the walls, the floors, the ceiling, the physical space. If we look at the speed of light, this becomes the velocity, the movement of people in space, their interactions. Now, when we look at it that way, what happens is the energy becomes the emerging quality of the space. There is a fundamental difference between focusing on delivering the built mass as a static form and actually focusing on how to foster interactions, how to foster flows to deliver the emerging quality of a space. And this is relevant beyond architecture into any field. Any service or product or task you are engaged in, there's a fundamental difference between focusing on that as a static product, this is what I'm delivering and that's it, or looking at that and looking what is the quality that that can offer beyond itself. And that's the whole shift again. This is again an illustration of shifting from the form to the flow, which means the driving force is the flow, the form follows. And what that means is then we start looking at spaces not as quantitative spaces, but as qualitative spaces. And this is where quality emerges. This is where this emerging quality we're talking about just comes about. This is the type of spaces that you will walk into and say, there is something about this space. And I don't know what it is, but it just feels right. It feels natural. I mentioned before how I believe architecture is a service. I'll take a moment to illustrate that. Traditionally, architects design and build buildings. They start at the beginning of design and until the end of construction, right when the building is ready to be inhabited. The minute people move into the space, the architects have gone, and they're never to be seen again on the site of the crime, basically. Exception to this building, sir. Now, I've always been very uncomfortable with that process because I've always felt that it's when people move into the space that the building's life, in fact, begins. And it's exactly then that I, as an architect, want to be the most involved. Now, this is like being pregnant for 9 months, excuse the inspiration of my metaphors, and then not having the baby, which is very unnatural. Architecture is, I believe, going into architecting. See, if you think of this from the perspective of interactions, architecture is static. It's architecting that's the living. This is the living phase of the project. This is when it all comes together. Architecture needs to extend into architecting. And this is, again, to recall, architecture is a process. It's a service. It's not something we just do, put out there, and move on to the next one. It's important to see how people are actually using it. How is it changing people's lives? I love the comment you mentioned in the introduction about the lady using this building. This is really what this is about. The question is how? I've asked this question before, but I didn't really answer it. I will now. The question is, how do we design contexts that foster interactions? And to bring that a little bit more down to earth, I'd like to offer 3 quite provocative design guidelines. And to do that, I want to go back to the campus story, the architect story. Now, the first design guideline I want to highlight from the story is that of designing incomplete. If you remember the story, the architect didn't finish and seal the design. She didn't complete the design and said, OK, this is where the paths are going to go, and that's it, and I'm done. She actually left the campus unfinished, incomplete. And that was exactly the invitation to the staff and students to participate, to give their input. Designing incomplete invites interaction. Now, I want to look at the consequences of what does it mean to design incomplete. And when you think about it, it means a shift of role, especially of the designer's role, a shift from being dictators to being facilitators. And that's a tremendous shift of role. Second provocative design guideline from the story is that of designing impermanent. Let's look at the story again. The site wasn't covered with asphalt. The architect chose grass, which is intrinsically flexible. Designing impermanent allows this flexibility to happen. It allows entities to change and grow and develop. Designing impermanent invites interaction. What designing impermanent means, it means we have to shift from our 2D and 3D thinking into 4D thinking. Buckminster Fuller, that many of you may be familiar with, was one of the forefathers of 4D thinking with what he called the 4D house. It's brilliant. You have to look it up if you're not familiar with it. It's one of my favorite architects, in a sense. Now, the reason 4D thinking is important in this context here today is specifically because it's a very important component of universal design. Even the same person changes over time. We will have different needs at different times over time, which is why 4D thinking is essential in universal design. OK, are you ready for the third provocative design guideline? Not quite. The third design guideline is to design imperfect. Not only were the paths in unusual locations that the architect couldn't actually have predicted herself, none of them were straight. Designing imperfect relates to aesthetics. It relates to human aesthetics. And this is where you have to imagine the sharp, cold, modern, so-called perfect aesthetics of modern architecture and compare that with a handmade Japanese pot, for example. Designing imperfect allows us to celebrate textures, smells, and history, and the humanity of even inanimate things. Designing imperfect invites interaction. And the consequence of that is very simple. We just have to make things more human. Think more human, design more human, produce more human. Ladies and gentlemen, designing incomplete, impermanent, and imperfect is how we create contexts that foster interactions. This is the answer to our driving question. Because incomplete, impermanent, and imperfect spaces are human spaces. They're spaces that are tolerant, that adapt, that grow with us. And this is where it all starts. We are at this conference about universal design, and I've been asked to share my thinking here with you from the perspective of universal design, and I'm happy and honored to do so, especially because this is something that's very natural for me to do. We may speak different languages and use different words, but really we're talking about the same thing. And again, all I hope to do here today is share with you some of my personal perspective, and hopefully we'll have some questions and answers where I can hear your thoughts and ideas. What I've personally learned about interaction design and universal design is this. Universal design is designing context for all people to interact. It's not just designing context for people. It's designing context for people to interact, and that's the key thing. That's the key message. And people interact with each other, they interact with the space, they interact with objects in the space, they interact through the space, etc., etc. And you don't design interaction, you design the context for interactions. And what were the guidelines to do that? Incomplete, imperfect, and impermanent. Architecting interaction is a vision. It started as an idea, a philosophy. It's a driving force behind our work. To make it reality, we had to actually develop a process. We had to sit down and say, how are we going to really do this? So what we did at AKKA is we developed this process. And the essential thing to remember about this process is that it's a collaborative process based on community consultations, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. And the other point of it is it's really based on the communal creation of knowledge. No one has the answer of what a space is going to be before the space is there, and even then it's questionable. Which means we have to actually create the knowledge of what the space is. We have to actually create those questions together. And together, and we means the architects, the engineers, the other professionals, and the users. The goal and the means of this process are one and the same. And that's, of course, on purpose. So this process has been designed to allow us to create spaces that foster interactions and collaboration. The way we do that, the way we get from the beginning to the end of the process is through interactions and collaboration. The goal and the means of this process are one and the same, and they relate to collaboration. Now, this process, as you can see, is a four-phase process, 3 of which happen before the delivery of the space, before the space is born, and the last phase happens after people have moved in. Our first phase is called appreciate, and in that phase, we simply aim at gathering a shared understanding of the project through community consultation sessions. Now, when I say community, I mean the different people concerned by the project. And if you were to take the example of a school, for example, you would think of the students, the teachers, the staff, the parents, the neighbors, the bus drivers, etc., etc. You have to think of it as a series of concentric circles, and each one of them would be a group of people. And the whole idea of the consultation that happens in that phase is a deliberate process of involving these people in the project that is theirs. Once we're done with phase 1 and we have a shared understanding of the project, we move into phase 2. Before we move into phase 2, it's important to remember that users are the experts in using the space. And that's why phase 1 is fundamental. Phase 1 has no design, so-called. There's no so-called architecture in it. It's really just understanding the different perspectives of the different people. Specifically because in using the space, the users are the expert. I mean, it just makes sense. Then we go into phase 2, which we call the kernel, and the kernel is the seed of something. It's where everything grows from. And the important thing to remember about the kernel is that it turns the shared understanding into a shared vision. This is where we start seeing at what the project is going to look like, feel like, be like, envisage. At the end of that phase is where we go into the kickstart phase, and this is where design development and implementation happens. The key about this phase is actually to keep design development and reality very close together. So we go through what we call learning by doing. We take an action in reality, we learn from it, let it inform our next action, and this is how the design actually develops, based on reality and real feedback and real input. Now, at the end of that phase is where normally and traditionally the building is done, it's handed over, and the architects leave. And this is where we have developed a phase 4 that we call adapt. And this phase can only start when people have moved into the building. Now, the key in this phase is it's by observing how people use the space that we can bring in the final fine-tuning and refinements to the space. This is where we ensure the space and the community actually fit. Somehow, the space is really serving the community that's living in it. This is the process we use. Appreciate, define the kernel, kickstart for adaptation. Now, of course, what you can realize is that the adapt phase creates a renewed understanding, a renewed appreciation of the project, which is why our process is, in fact, not a linear one, but a circular one. There are 3 qualities I want to highlight about this process. The first one has to do with the process itself. You see, the process is based on people's input. It's designed as an open process. It will not advance if we don't have people's input and participation in it. It's designed as an incomplete process. The second aspect I want to emphasize about this process is the fact that it actually grows and develops and changes along those inputs given by the people, by the users, along also our own experts, so-called architects, understanding that's evolving as we go, because we're learning from the users and their input. And this continuous change of the process is what makes it impermanent. Now, when I talk about people actually participating in the process, and this process being very collaborative, we're talking about getting insights from people. And the key here is insights and not opinions. You see, opinions and insights are fundamentally different. An opinion is really a subjective, I like it, I don't like this, I think that, and that's generally not very helpful. What this process is looking at is really getting insights, which are supposed to be a bit more objective and based on the experience. So the different groups of the community, the different profiles of people involved by the project will all tell you something different. And what we're looking for is how they experience the space, because it's through their experience that we can actually learn. And the fact that this process feeds on insights, people's insights, is exactly what makes it human and imperfect. Remember, we don't design interactions, we design the context for interactions. And it's important that this context is a universal context. What I'd like to do here for a second is quickly recap. Architecting interaction is about creating context for people to interact. And that's because every area of our world needs to foster interactions, only to varying degrees. Now, the key things to remember is to shift our attention from the form to the flow and let the form emerge from the flow. Architecture is a service. And that's a fundamental understanding we need to have. And if we remember the formula E = mc squared, it's really about shifting from the static mass to delivering the energy. The question is, how do we deliver the energy of the space? Another thing to keep in mind is we don't design interaction, we design the context for interactions. I cannot repeat that one enough. Now, when you ask, how do we do this? How do we create spaces that foster interactions? It's really by designing incomplete, impermanent, and imperfect spaces through a process that is in itself incomplete, impermanent, and imperfect. This is what the essence of architecting interaction is, and this is what I believe the essence of universal design is. So the last things I'd like to share with you today here is architecture is really designing for people, and people of different sizes and different shapes with different needs at different times. This is what universal design is. And I like to think of universal design as a call to action, and a call that does not limit us, but rather liberates us. Because universal design is designing context for all people to interact. Because after all our actions are interactions. Thank you very much.